Okay, APUSH, I'm going to take you through the final years of the Vietnam War. So we've been studying kind of how this was really a war we got pulled into for various reasons. And you know the role that Lyndon Johnson played here. I'm going to kind of talk to you about when Johnson decides not to run again, and then we'll look at Nixon and Vietnamization and the final years of the war and talk about its legacy. So you know, as we saw, that the Tet Offensive is considered the turning point of the war. Now, it's important to note that this is a victory for the United States, but what the Tet Offensive really proved was that the Viet Cong were nowhere near surrendering. And I think Lyndon Johnson had been really trying to sell the story that we were winning in the war, that this was getting closer to being over. But the Viet Cong are able to sneak in weapons through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is in Laos and Cambodia. I'm going to show you a picture of that so you'll see what that entails. But 7 cities are attacked all on the same day. So it's a very hard fought win, but it's definitely at home going to make people really want to get out of this war. So Johnson is demoralized, he's tired, he's frustrated, and he kind of surprised everybody when he wasn't going to run for president again. So that threw the Democratic Party into a bit of a tailspin. They already were starting to be in a bit of a tailspin because there was talk of challenging Johnson in the nomination for the presidency. But what we're going to see is the Democratic National Convention had massive anti-war protests, and this was in Chicago in 1968. Protests break out. It's just a mess. It's just a mess, and the Democrats finally nominate Hubert H. Humphrey. But I think most people by 1968 were really tired of what is happening in Vietnam. And also, you have to remember also, guys, that the civil rights movement is going on at the same time. The long, hot summers are happening. There's a lot of just tumultuous things going on in 1968. Bobby Kennedy actually was running for the Democratic nomination and was killed in June. So it's an unprecedented year. So if you look at, here's the breakdown. Richard Nixon winning both the popular vote and the electoral vote. Probably not surprising you that George Wallace is going to carry the states that he does under the American Independent Party, and Hubert Humphrey is not able to win. So we get Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon says, I'm going to roll back. We're not losing, right? We're not losing, but he comes up with this word called Vietnamization, which means withdrawal with honor. So here's Vietnam, you guys. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, see what they're doing? They're going through Laos and Cambodia, and they're sneaking weapons in. And that's the problem. We can guard this border all we want, but unless you can stop something over here, you're not going to be able to stop the attacks that are going to go to the south. So as we're withdrawing our troops, the VC attacks will get stronger. Well, Nixon says he's going to bring people home, so he still wants to do that, but he obviously doesn't want to lose. So this is when he orders secret bombings of Laos and Cambodia. He's going after that Ho Chi Minh Trail. He's trying to knock them out. And people find out. We're getting to that era where you can't really do things totally in secret anymore. People found out. This got out, and there were protests all across the country, but the protests at Kent State and Jackson State turned violent. And the ones in Kent State, of course, as you probably know, we'll go over here, that killed 4 students. And so you had the National Guard called in to control the protesters. This is a very famous picture, although this is not a student who died. These are the students who died, but it's definitely going to shock a lot of people and make people at home really more than ever want to get out of this war. The pressure is on. Another thing that I want to talk about, and this is just a really, really horrible story, but the My Lai massacre that you see on your timeline actually happens in 1968. And the plain dealer, actually, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, posted some of the really graphic images that we now know are what happened. The story breaks in 69. There's actually a trial in 1970 for one of the lieutenants who was accused of killing. There are somewhere between, we don't quite know for sure. The numbers are as low as the 300s and as high as the low 500s of civilians killed in one single day. And what came out through the trial was you had this company that had been out for a while. They had lost 40 guys. They were extremely stressed. And not that I am defending this at all. Okay, I'm trying to at least say, here's what happened. They snapped, and they started just killing civilians, and it was horrific. This picture was snapped, supposedly, according to court documents, right before these people were shot. The woman behind, you can't see it in this picture, but in the other angle of this very famous picture, she's adjusting her blouse. And in the court testimony, it came out that she was adjusting her blouse because she had been sexually assaulted by an American soldier. When we talk about how American soldiers' images were really getting hurt, because of the search and destroy missions. They're getting called baby killers. This is going to make everything worse. Everything worse. And it's one of the worst slaughters of civilians by US soldiers that we've ever seen. This is a very famous picture. It's not from that particular event, but it was a napalm attack. Napalm's kind of a jellied gasoline. It burns to anything it touched. And that's why this little girl had thrown her clothes off and was running down the street. These images, you guys, these are going to make people at home even more really be against the war. And there was what Richard Nixon called a silent majority, that he said, I do know you do support our soldiers and you do support the war and you do think it's good that we're there to stop communism. But I would say by 1970, a lot of Americans were saying, you know what, we're not sure this is still worth it, and it makes, again, it's hard because our soldiers were fighting with their heart and soul and doing what they were told, that was it. So it's kind of a bad situation all around. Peace talks were going nowhere. Henry Kissinger, right there, was trying to get a peace deal reached, doesn't succeed. It takes years to get a peace deal reached. Finally, in January 1973, there's a ceasefire peace deal agreed, and it divides Vietnam at the 17th parallel. So what we end up with is a very Korea-esque situation where you've got the North and you've got the South. Well, what we're going to see, though, is, remember we mentioned this before, South Vietnam was never strong enough to stand on their own. That's always been the problem. And once we start withdrawing our troops, the North will continue to attack and they're going to close in. The other thing that is going on while all this is going on, and we're going to study this next week, is the Watergate scandal. We have our first president that has to resign in disgrace because he has broken many laws. That shatters people's confidence in their government. Vietnam shatters it. The Watergate scandal shatters it. The mid-1970s, I would say, were not really a high point for us. This was a low point. We also, by the way, had a massive recession, massive inflation. Mrs. Richardson and I like to joke that she and I are really the only good thing coming out of the late 1970s. There's not a whole lot of good things coming out of the late 1970s. It's a pretty depressing time where there's a lot of, just like I said, shattering of trust. So President Ford walks into the situation after Vietnam. There he is. He's the only president to never be vice president or president elected. He got appointed vice president to fill a hole that was left by Spiro Agnew, who had resigned in disgrace, Nixon's original vice president. And then Nixon had to resign in disgrace. So you have a guy here who has never been elected to president or vice president, thrown into this situation. And South Vietnam is surrounded, Saigon is surrounded. And Kissinger says, look, what do you want to do? Do you want to start the draft? Do you want to go back in? Like, what are we going to do here? And I give Gerald Ford a lot of credit for this. And he basically said, this is over. We are leaving. We are done. And on April 30th, 1975, he said it was the hardest decision he ever had to make. But he ordered all U.S. personnel to evacuate Saigon, knowing that we were going to leave behind some of our South Vietnamese allies that we had worked with for so long. And they would probably be captured. They would probably be killed, or at best brainwashed. Saigon falls to the communists. It is renamed what it's called today, Ho Chi Minh City. And that's it, you guys. This does not end well. So let's look at some of the images. People were desperate to get out of there. You see South Vietnamese climbing the fence into the U.S. Embassy, trying to hang on to the helicopters. That because they knew what it meant if this fell. And the soldiers would ditch their boots and just run into the countryside and hope they could blend in and pretend they were a farmer, pretend they never fought. Because, again, they took up arms against the communists. So it was a sad day, but I think overwhelmingly a lot of Americans breathed a sigh of relief knowing that it was over. But this is not how we wanted this to go. There's a lot of lessons to be learned here of what not to do. Look at this chaos here. April 30th, 75, they're climbing in, trying to get in. What is the legacy? Well, about 58,000 U.S. deaths. That's a lot. That's a lot when in the end, you don't accomplish the goal you set out to accomplish. So, and I know you guys got to see the wall in in Washington, D.C. I know I did in 8th grade. I remember in 8th grade going, okay, there's a wall with names. That's cool. Like, I didn't know what I was looking at. The next time you go to D.C. and you look at that wall, I want you to really look at that wall. It goes in order of people killed. So it starts in, I think, 1958, the first American killed, all the way till 1975. And when you look at those names, and now you guys understand the backstory that these guys were 18, 19, 20 years old, not allowed to vote, by the way, about the people who were sending them there. That's why we get that 26th Amendment in 1971, which lowers the voting age to 18. So they can still draft you, but at least now you have a voice in choosing who's sitting in Congress that's making those decisions. So that's another important thing we want to recognize about the Vietnam War. Lack of trust. You guys, I don't think we've gotten this back. I mean, I really don't think we have. This shatters trust between the 1-2 punch of this and Watergate are going to shatter Americans' trust in the executive branch in a way that we hadn't seen before. Social changes at home. There is a lot of upheaval from this. There's a lot of things we're going to need to talk about that our veterans are really, especially when they come home, a lot of people are disrespecting them, calling them baby killers. You have to remember these guys were doing their legal duty. You had no choice if you couldn't afford college. You were breaking the law if you didn't, answer your draft card. I mean, that's what you had to do. So it's a reminder that if you disagree with a war, you don't want to take it out on the wrong people. Go after the people who are making those decisions, not the ones who are forced to follow orders. Although with the My Lai massacre, that raises a whole nother level of issues that we need to deal with. Instability in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Okay, this is gonna cause more instability. There's a reason, guys, why Pol Pot comes and does what he does from 1975 to 79. It's because of the instability that's created here. There are some effects, mass migration of, we've got refugees, we've got people who are dealing with the after effects of this. And so we are going to see a piece of legislation, and you want to pay special attention to this because it's in your DBQ. The War Powers Act of 1973. This is the opposite of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Congress passes a law that essentially says, look, once American troops go somewhere, you have 90 days to give Congress a reason, or we will pull the funding. So that is something that they can now kind of make sure that there are no more sort of long drawn out unofficial wars, actions of a president without the approval of Congress. So that's very significant. The other thing I wanted to end on, which is both happy and sad, is we talked a little bit about how American servicemen, they were lonely and they often hung out with the Saigon women when they were on leave. Well, there were a lot of babies and children that were the product of an American serviceman and a Vietnamese woman. And when Saigon was falling, those women knew that these babies would be tortured, they would be killed. And so a lot of these women would just drop off these babies at orphanages and just leave them because they knew that, a lot of these kids didn't quite look Vietnamese. You can kind of tell that she's biracial, and they knew, and they didn't want their children to be tortured. And here's a itty bitty little baby. Look at that, baby feet. So there were 2 planes called Operation Baby Lift here, April 75. Gerald Ford recognized that we had a responsibility. And he said, we need to get these children to the United States where they can be adopted. 2 planes that were carrying these children that left. 1 plane crashed, killing 138 people, including 127 of the orphans. However, as you can see, over half the passengers survived the crash. The other plane made it. And I always throw this story in because my friend's now ex-boyfriend, his name is Tom. He was part of Operation Baby Lift. He was about a year old. They don't know his birthday. They guessed, a lot of times they guessed, and it's not like there's birth certificates or official paperwork, but they guessed May 1st, 74, because he was about a year old. And he came to the United States on that second plane, and he was adopted by a wonderful family in Denver, Colorado, and his name is Tom Ritchie, and he, grew up with that family. And my friend said, there's reunions of the Operation Baby Lift kids, and she always said, well, are you going to go? And he said, no, he never really had any interest in going. He said that my family here is my family. So he was very lucky and was adopted by a wonderful family. And but it's another legacy, it's another legacy. It's kind of another piece of the story that I always like to end on. Sad note, but also kind of a happy note. So think about what goes right here. Think about what goes wrong. I guess when you look at Vietnam, we look at this and kind of see there's a lot of mistakes. And I think it's a good thing to think about when you say, what went wrong here? What can we make sure doesn't go wrong again? So I want you to think about that as you study it.